Welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name is Frank Lipo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society of Oak Park and River Forest, which I know some of you know from our years in Pleasant Home, but also at our new Oak Park River Forest Museum at the corner of Lombard and Lake Street. And
I'm Frank Heitzman. I'm an architect here in Oak Park, and Frank and I created an organization back in February to try to save 644 Madison Street, which is the Foley Rice, was originally the Foley Rice automobile dealership, and before that it was the Hill Motor Company. Okay, the Hill Motor Company building. Trying to get the picture back up here. Go ahead. Since that time, we've been meeting on a weekly basis to try to figure out a way to preserve this building while still allowing it to be used for, the site to be used for a new grocery store, Pete's Fresh Market grocery store. So we're trying to do both. And so that was the genesis of this talk this evening, is to talk about how to use existing buildings that are wonderful, high-quality buildings and incorporate them into another wonderful, high-quality new development. And we'll hear tonight from experts in this field that will tell us their experiences in doing it. We hope that all of the areas of concern will be touched on. Those of preservation, those of economic development, and those of sustainability. So what I'm going to do now is to give you a little bit of introduction to who our sponsors are. And the first sponsor that you see there is 19th Century Charitable Association. And Frank, you want to talk about that?
yeah, I just want to say a few words. We're just grateful to Gene Schultz, Angel, and the 19th Century for hosting tonight. We hope that you are enjoying, those of you who might be new to the building, or those who have been here a lot through the years, are enjoying this local landmark built in 1928 and listed as a contributing resource to the Frank Laurita Historic District. The 19th Century is a privately funded 501c3 organization whose mission is to strengthen the community through learning, giving, and sharing this landmark building. The board, staff, and members are proudly caring for this historic resource and investing in its future, as you can see. We're here in the beautifully renovated first floor dining rooms and lounge. Over $700,000 in private donations has been invested in this building over the last 5 years to restore or renovate the exterior, ballroom, and first floor. If you'd like to know more about the events, humanities programming, private rentals, see a staff member. And I know that the ballroom is open tonight if you'd like to take a look, and if you haven't been up to the ballroom for a while. And Jean's over there, she'd wave hands. So we're grateful to be here. In fact, I'm very proud. Through the years, I had the opportunity to actually write the Historic Landmark nomination for this building, so it's a real source of pride being in it, and all this investment that's just keeping it going and going and going for another generation. So thank you, and then back to Frank.
Our other sponsors are the Save the Hill Coalition, which is the organization that Frank and I put together. The Oak Park River Forest Museum, which Frank is the executive director of. It was the Oak Park River Forest Historical Society, it was the traditional name. Unity Temple Restoration Foundation, we have Heidi here representing them in back. Heidi Roulemay. Landmarks Illinois, and we have Lisa DiChiara here from Landmarks Illinois representing them. She's going to be one of our panelists. Oak Park Historic Preservation Commission, and the commission chair is here, and several of the members of the commission I can see in the audience. Chris Payne is the chair, the current chair. The River Forest Historic Preservation Commission, is there anybody here representing them?
Yes.
Back here? Very good. And the Berwyn Historic Preservation Commission, anybody from Berwyn? Oak Park Environmental and Energy Commission is a sponsor. AIA Chicago and AIA Northeast Illinois, which is sponsoring continuing education units for those of you who need it, who are members of the AIA. And the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, Midwest chapter. Presenter tonight is Mike Jackson, who will be introduced shortly. And the panel is Doug Gilbert, will be our moderator, Laurita McIntosh Blank, Lisa DiChiara from Landmarks Illinois, Gunny Harbo, a restoration architect, and Stephen Kelly, who is a historic preservation specialist. They're our speakers and our panel for this evening. Northeastern Illinois is a registered provider with the American Institute of Architects Continuing Education Systems. And you can earn credit here for that. So here's your learning objectives for this evening. That we put up. Understand and help how to identify the important historic resources in your community. Know why preservation of existing buildings contributes toward environmental sustainability. Recognize that historic preservation is the original green approach to building design and construction. Know why reuse of historic resources contribute to increased value and livability of the community. And finally, to appreciate how preservation, economic development, and environmental sustainability can support one another. That's the main theme of our presentation today. So I'd like to introduce now Doug Gilbert, who is our moderator. Doug is I'm going to bring up the next slide. Doug is a preservation architect, an award-winning architect who's been in practice for about 20 years now. He was the longtime chair of the Oak Park Historic Preservation Commission and a member of the Oak Park Plan Commission as well. So he's been very active in local governmental affairs. And he is going to then moderate this program this evening and introduce our main speaker, Mike Jackson. So Doug, if you want to come up.
I don't know if being moderator, if I have to kind of do what they do at the Oscars or not, you know, do a little song and dance before we get started, but maybe
Tell a joke.
Tell a joke, yeah. After knocking my wine glass over at dinner, I think I'm done with telling jokes. All right, so it is my pleasure. Actually, before I introduce Mike, I want to just kind of outline the itinerary for this evening. We're going to start with a keynote address by Mike Jackson, who I'll introduce in a moment, and that'll last for about 45 minutes or so. I'm going to ask that we hold questions for Mike until we do the panel. There'll be an opportunity then for questions from the audience. So after Mike's presentation, I will bring the panel up and introduce those in a random order. We actually didn't decide who's going to talk when or whatever, but each panelist will have a few minutes to say a few words about the topic, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation, dialogue amongst the panelists. I'm going to ask Mike to also join the panel as well, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if you have a question about Mike's presentation in particular, he'll be up here to answer those, or if you have a question that comes up during the dialogue with the panelists, you can ask at that time. We're supposed to be here till about 9, so part of my job is, like at the Oscars, keep us on track. There'll be music playing at some point, or something like that. All right, so it is my pleasure this evening to introduce Mike Jackson, fellow of the AIA. Mike is recently retired as a manager of the Preservation Services Division of what used to be known as the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency. He continues to serve as a visiting professor of architecture at the University of Illinois at Urbana, and is a deep thinker about main streets and their connection to long-term sustainability and a future constrained by resource availability. Mike holds degrees from the University of Illinois Urbana and Columbia University. He's a founding member of the Association for Preservation Technology, the Committee on Sustainable Heritage, and he's active in the development of green building standards and preservation policies. He's also active in the field of historic preservation throughout his career, and has been a leader in topics such as roadside architecture, Main Street, recent past, and sustainability. So I think you hopefully will agree that he's really the perfect person to keynote the address for this evening. So without further ado, Mike Jackson.
Thank you. All right, so I don't have a joke, but I do have a story. My granddaughter was over the other day. She's young and bouncy and cute, and she was excited about doing things, and she said, let's do a play, which meant she's going to be the star, my wife and I will be the audience. Now, she knows how this works. She's seen the professionals. We're sitting, we look up at her, and she looks at us and goes, ladies and gentlemen, please turn off your cell phones. Absolutely true story, and that granddaughter graduated from college on Saturday. So, anyway, Thank you for having me here. I've got a little bit of storytelling to do. I'm going to take you through some history of preservation and give you some background on things that lead to this discussion tonight. Just to start, I grew up just south of Galena. I did my undergraduate thesis on Main Street, Galena in 1972, so I've been at this for a while. But tonight, I'm going to cover kind of three topics. A little bit about the history of preservation and our thought process, something on design and the integration of design in historic places, and then connect back to sustainability. So I've got kind of three different themes that I'm going to run through tonight. The first, of course, place to start with is what is historic preservation? And this is sort of a process definition from the National Trust, a process of identifying, protecting, and enhancing the places, the objects that give historic and cultural significance. So it's kind of an organization of things, how to look at the world, survey it, understand what's important, and then work towards its preservation. But I'm going to make a point here that I think historic preservation carries some bigger weight in that we're really the only entity that's really an organized building reuse program. There really is no National Building Reuse Society. There's a New Building Institute. There's all kinds of entities promoting new construction and things. But we've, from being a small group preservation, we've actually taken on the larger task of promoting building reuse as a whole, beyond just our cultural side. And it's taken us a while to make movement on changing the culture. And as a point of reference here, the first National Building Code was 1905. It took 100 years till 2003 to get a national existing building code. In other words, moving the culture of the built environment to really look collectively at how we work with existing buildings. So there's a lag here, and preservation is 50 years ahead of this lag, but that's part of my theme here tonight, is that we've been innovators in thinking how to do building reuse. And we do it against this context. Every day, assaulting messages tell us, buy new stuff. You just don't see ads on TV that say, don't buy a new one, the old one could be made even better. But that's what we do every day. So, give ourselves a little credit. We're swimming against a stream that's pushing the other direction. And we've got a different message. So, let's get personal. Let's get topical. What's going on in the world? This caught everybody's attention. The whole idea of a landmark that's international in significance, everybody knows about it. It has a disaster, we've got to respond. That's one side of it. But what I like about it is that the New Yorker had a feature story about historic preservation, and the comment here, what might seem like a straightforward drama of historicity versus modernity is complicated in Notre Dame's recent past. And when they say recent past, they mean a few hundred years. The reality is, let's take this cue to talk about preservation. The recent past that they're talking about is the tower and the roof reconstruction on Notre Dame. This is the designer, Viollet-le-Duc. He did it in the mid-19th century. He's kind of one of the most documented early historic preservation architects. But he came from a whole different philosophy. And this is his words for restoration. Both the thing and the word are modern. To restore an edifice means neither to maintain it, nor to repair it, nor to rebuild it. It means to reestablish it in a finished state, which may in fact never have existed at any given time. And boy, when I read this in college years ago, it's like, this is perplexing. This guy's like a design guy. He's not a preservationist. But I'm coming to respect him a lot more. This is the couple of his pieces he worked on. Actually, he didn't really do much on the Eiffel Tower, but Carcassonne, one of the great medieval villages of the world, he led the restoration of that. And he did it in the 19th century. And it looks really cool. He did a great job. But those little conical towers sitting on top of those turrets, that's all something he made up. It's not historic in our modern standards of authenticity. He enhanced it. He made it in a more finished state that may have never existed. And quite frankly, he did a really good job of it. Because no one has ever looked at this and went, boy, those things really look bad, don't they? No, people look at this and go, it's the form, it's charming, he's got it. He had a sense of the past and how to work with it as a designer. Now, in contrast, at the same time that Viollet-le-Duc is working in France. You've got Ruskin in England. Now, he's not an architect. He's more of a theorist about all these things. And he's famous for his quote about, when we build, let us think we build not for the present, but for the future and forever, etc. But then, when it comes to preservation, it is impossible as it is to raise the dead, to restore anything that has ever been great or beautiful in architecture. Boy, that's a tough act to follow. Man, don't even try. So, we got Viollet-le-Duc, we can design them better, we can add things, and you got Ruskin going, don't touch anything. You don't mess with it. There's nothing you can do better. But Ruskin was a good guy. He organized this, the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, or SPAB, not necessarily an acronym that's going to jump out at you, but SPAB still exists today. You can join. I'm going to get a membership card. I think I need to be a SPAB. But anyway, I think this is the first preservation organization. They got together, they did survey, they went to photograph buildings, they documented things, they produced a response about what to do with the old buildings. And then Ruskin says this, that those who make changes wrought in our day under the name of restoration, while professing to bring back a building to the best time of its history, have no guide but each his own individual whim to point out whether it is admirable or what is contemptible. So keep that in mind, admirable and contemptible. But what Ruskin's doing here is proposing we need a philosophy of how to preserve and restore. What does it mean? It shouldn't just be personal whim. Maybe that's what Viollet-le-Duc was doing, but he still did it within a sense of compatibility, I would argue. And it took them a few years, but in 1903, SPAB published Notes on the Repair of Ancient Buildings, which I contend is the original Secretary of Interior standards, or the first version. So SPAB got their act together. They started to go, how do we fix things up? What's our premise? We jump forward in 1931, the Athens Charter. A lot of archaeologists, some architects get together and we develop our next set of principles about preservation. It's international. We've got to think about modern techniques and materials may be used in restoration work. They loved concrete. They thought concrete was going to be the master property. But the point is, they're starting to get a little more sophisticated than whim and fancy. Then we move up to the 60s, the Venice Charter in 64. Broadens the definition of what are historic places with more modest things rather than just the super monuments and the fancy, the idea of conservation for socially useful purpose, scale, specialized knowledge that's required, respecting change over time. The words like harmonious and distinguishable start to show up, and additions that do not distract from the interesting parts of the building. So again, we're getting a little more, besides the preservation issue, the Venice Charter is starting to get into design and related issues of what goes on next to the building or in a setting. In America, preservation comes of age in the 60s with the National Preservation Act following the demolition of Penn Central. And it comes under Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society. Preservation was embedded within government. The decision about what's historic and what's valued was given to the public through the National Park Service, and then later through the certified local governments, the way in which local powers to designate things came about. But this is the point. We've gotten to this comprehensive way to look at what's in historic. We've got a complicated and multifaceted program to look and evaluate resources so we can decide as a collective culture what are the things that we value of our past. And we've got a test for that. But going back to Ruskin and the admirable and the contemptible, that was 1878. It wasn't until 1977, 100 years after the SPAB got started, that we got the Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, which in effect becomes a national building code for how to fix up old buildings and historic buildings. So 77, they published it. 78, we did the first of the preservation briefs. And since that time, this set of principles have been used for thousands of renovation reviews. This is just the federal tax credit program. More than 44,000 properties have gone through the program review of meeting the standards for the purposes of the tax certification program. Plus, countless local preservation commissions have adopted and are using these. There's published versions of the briefs and interpretations, and it's like case law in effect. So give ourselves some credit. We have, as preservationists, developed pretty good comprehensive sense of how to look at old buildings and think about their reuse and what we can do to them from technical and design side. And now we're also going to put into that the economic side of it. But there is some confusion about this. The Secretary of Interior standards are meant to apply to the rehab of existing buildings and additions connected to them. They do not apply to new buildings that are built freestanding outside of the context of a rehab review. That's where preservation guidelines come into play. And many communities have developed guidelines. There's part of the planning process is setting up what do we see when we want to put new and old. And here there's a lot more subjectivity going on about what's the architectural character, and those words harmonious and compatible come into play. So now we're going to divvy out into design out of preservation. And there's been one or several different theories and approaches about how new designs in old areas should look. Here's a classic, this is a great example, because there's an historic building on the left, and there's a new building that replicates its form and massing and fenestration pattern, but with all new materials in a whole new way. So here's one way to respect and replicate, or be compatible, but not duplicative. And I would say in many commissions this would be seen as acceptable. It sort of pushes the idea of modernity, but it also meets the basic premise of massing and setback and the things that would show up in a lot of design guidelines. So that's kind of one formula. Replicate form and fenestration, and then the details can vary. But there's a lot more going on in that. In 2010, Historic Environment Scotland published their new designs in historic settings, and really said, we can accept a much more modern intervention within a place. We're not tied to just replicating form and presence and massing. Let's get something along with the placement of things, but let's just admit that new buildings can be new buildings. And this is, again, within an urban context primarily. And I have a lot of respect for the folks at Historic Environment Scotland and what they're doing. And then the Chicago Landmarks Commission approved this new addition to the Michigan Avenue street wall, 2008. An empty lot in an urban setting, and basically the commission said our role is not to redesign it, not to make it more, there's a lot of latitude for the design professional when it's infill. And I will guarantee you that commissions across the country review this very differently. ELSA, Illinois, the commission, Southern Illinois, a town of 800 people with a fully functioning preservation commission. Their preservation guidelines say if you're putting a new building, the first thing you should do is to find out what building existed there historically and try and rebuild it. That was their premise. You start by going, well, can we rebuild what was there once? So that's one place to start from. But there's a lot of latitude in that. And here's an interesting example and timely, right? This IMP guy, he was really good. He put a new thing right in the middle of a very historic environment. And I think it's been one of the most successful interventions ever, where a little jewel-like modern thing sits in a much larger historic context and does both things programmatically and design-wise that work to serve all generations, new and old. So a really excellent example. But now, where does this lead me? Just to tell you that there are others who don't always agree about new, and there is indeed a whole separate side of the movement of building new buildings that look like traditional buildings. Traditional building is out there. There is the Notre Dame program in architecture that's training a new generation of architects on how to design new buildings in period styles. So again, as a preservation commission, you can't say no. You can't ever design in an old style. After all, the Gothic and Greek revival, and classical revival, were reviving things from 1,000 years ago. So can we have the Victorian revival? Yes. We'll probably even have the Art Deco revival, and someday we'll have postmodernism revival. Trust me, the cycles never end. I was recently up in La Crosse, Wisconsin. This is a new pilgrimage church done, by the archdiocese up there. It won a traditional building Palladio Award. I mean, you walk inside this thing and you would not know that you were not in some 19th century town in the middle of Italy. And you were just basically into a whole traditional design motif. Everything about it looks like it could have been designed in the 19th century to the, I don't know, go how far back. But You know, so there are people working in this idiom. It's one of those things that is particularly popular within religious and residential as well. So traditional design is not gone away. So to be fair, you know, I'm showing modern in the new historic context. I'm also saying that there are times when tradition is fine. And if you want to know more about this, I have a Pinterest board called The Tradition Continues, and it's more examples of new buildings that are done in traditional styles, many of which are drawn from the Palladio Awards. But there's some interesting new trends going on in architecture in the world and preservation. Now I'm going to challenge us all to think outside the box of where are we going with this. And this one does go outside the box, right? This was a little two-story building in the meat market area of lower Manhattan, little Chelsea. And recently Restoration Hardware put their new signature store, restaurant, everything in there. And this new building pops up through there. Now you're dealing with New York City where density can be really high, major urban marketplace. So, you know, the idea of density pressures and preservation are coming to fro. And, you know, this might be not our typical historic preservation approach, but it's certainly good urbanism that revitalizes the city, puts a lot of new investment. And within the zoning envelopes of New York, you know, this is relatively modest. But this idea that you can put a new hat on top of an historic building is taken some weird turns. Now, I actually like this one. I think this one kind of like, it's so original in what it is it's trying to be. You can clearly distinguish the new from the old. It's one criteria of the student. And, you know, it's a good design for an interesting program, but it's not necessarily a standard preservation approach, but it shows you kind of where some, this thinking is going on in Europe a lot. Then there's this one, Zaha Hadid. This is an administrative office building for the Port Authority, and they needed to expand it and put a new addition on it. And this one challenges everything that I can think of. It's distinguishable, you know, like buildings. But, you know, the structural gymnastics to create something like this actually cost a lot of money, you know, compared to other ways to approach this thing. But again, this is hot, new age design thing going on, and there's kind of a trend of this one-smanship of the other of, you know, what can I do to be the most outrageous new thing on top of the old thing? Which leads you to this. No surprise that, you know, the fire wasn't cold yet, and the new designs are coming out, that we should put a new type of spire on Notre Dame. We shouldn't be restoring it. We shouldn't be doing that context-based. We should just, it's our chance to put something new up there. And they're doing it, and other designers are doing it. So the French are going to have to handle this debate. The last I heard was there's a move towards traditional. And traditional could mean putting back the Viollet-le-Duc 19th century tower, which was really a well-designed intervention. There. We'll see how this one plays out. But I'm presenting this in the context of these other projects of major new additions and things sticking outside of the envelope of buildings. That's where some designers are approaching any building as an opportunity to put something outrageously different. And if you want more examples of this, my Pinterest board, new and old, has 340 pieces in it now, mostly European, but not only, of big new things sticking out of old things. So it's one new trend out there in historic preservation / design urbanism. So I'm on a little track here from historic preservation to modern intervention and what does it mean, and some challenging new assumptions. And then there's the American version of this, Washington, D.C., which doesn't particularly have huge density. I mean, they still have their about 8.5. The Washington, D.C. Local Preservation Commission generally considers that if you keep the first 20 feet of the building, that's enough preservation, and then in the back they can take off and do this. A bad policy decision in my viewpoint, but it leads to things like this. Again, where increased urban density pressures and older buildings, you know, other tools, this is one of the problems that they're having, but they've kind of reached this point where they're kind of like, okay, here's our formula, keep the first 20 feet, and then you get to put something else. Even though you're within limits are not hard, you know, it's fairly low scale. But the facadectomy is one response to that. This is probably one of the more outrageous of the facadectomies. New York City, where the Hearst Building built a new building. It's the same company. They wanted more density. They kept their old building exterior and built a new building inside it. Again, hired one of the European architects from Gloucester, England, and he comes up with this new building inside the old building. But from the streetscape, there's a sense of tradition and detail and craftsmanship that was all maintained. There's a few of these. Chicago has not been much of a center of this. There's a few. There's one on Wabash behind the library where they did that. Oh, wait. And then there is this one. Yeah. I got in trouble for this one. Back when I was working for the state, Blair came and called me and said, "What do you think of that?" And I said, "It sounds like a facadectomy to me." And I hadn't even reviewed the design. I just had that, and he quoted me on that. The next day, the governor called the director of historic preservation and said I should have a different job assignment. No, that was George Ryan. He ended up in prison, and I had a 31-year career. So it was a tricky moment, I must tell you. It wasn't the best day at the office, but survived that one. But I think on the whole, we've all kind of agreed this isn't necessarily the best preservation. It's a programmatic compromise. And then there's this. This is when it's no longer just about sticking something new on top of the old. And this is Daniel Liebeskin's. And he's done a bunch of these now. His sort of slash and burn interventions, tradition and new things just colliding. And that's his shtick. That's his, this is what he thinks should be done. And he's got a few museum plans. He was going to do this in DC, I think, and they turned him down on that one. So anyway, he's found a few people that buy this idea of this intervention between but it's not a popular style. It isn't catching on universally. Okay, so we've got history lessons behind us. We've got some different theories of how to intervene there and all. Let's move on to the Foley race hill motorcycles. I love these little guys. This is up there. Now, does that guy up on the left not look like Ronald Reagan? Did you notice that? Yeah, really. These are just delightful, and they're part of that ornamentation of the street. And this is one of the most character-defining features of this building. These are really superb. Now, Chicago, 15 years ago, did a motor historic district. Jim Peters was then at the commission, headed up the effort to get this landmark district of the early automobile sales buildings, designated it as a collective, and these buildings are being renovated on a regular basis. Much of it is residential conversion on the upper floors, but commercial stuff's happening, and it's been quite successful. Revitalizing the South Loop. South Michigan is pretty dead down there, and it's really coming back. And the historic district was one of the leaders with that, with the tax credit program helping make that all happen. Although it did hit a weak spot in 2008 with the economy. Whole Foods in Chicago on the upper, where this one is now. But, this is the generic new edition. Bulk mass just stuck in there, not trying to do anything beyond just be built form to add, scale and space to an operation. And, is this something that's out there for the potential? I think for the Hill building, that the current proposal is a small one-scale building or one-story building. So you're not really approaching this idea from scale or density. So that's a couple things, just looking at that building as a resource and some things, and I know Frank has done some more research on options. But I want to finish and move to this third part of my triad tonight on this issue of climate change. And really, the federal government is backpedaling on it under the Trump administration, but cities are taking the lead in states of having climate action programs and being proactive. What should we do? Boulder is probably ahead of any other city that I can think of in the country in having a climate change policy, a complete set of mandates and principles on how to approach it, crafted documents, public review components to this, looking at all the different things that they can do as a city to basically meet a climate neutral position by 2050 on the greenhouse gas side of the equation. So they're probably in the lead. They have focused a lot on energy because basically half of the US energy is in buildings and operations and construction of them. So, when you think about the big uses of energy, it's not just about your cars, it's not just about industry, but buildings. Buildings take up a huge amount of our energy, and when it comes to electricity, it's most of the electricity. So no question but what Boulder's central focus on the first priority is first greening the infrastructure of getting electricity, so moving to renewables for electricity. And then high-performance buildings is the next of the strategies. And renovation of existing buildings is key because they're not going to build a lot of new buildings in Boulder in the next 30 years. They're basically going to have to retrofit every existing building, however, to meet these mandates. So the whole issue of where do we move our performance standards and where do we get the most bang for our buck in terms of getting climate change is existing buildings and their renovation and making them more efficient. Now, Parks Canada did a really wonderful study that said historic buildings can be just as energy efficient as new buildings, and they looked at the kind of typical buildings you might find around here. And a wonderful new book, Building Reuse, a young architect out of Seattle, did case studies, and these case studies are really good. They're not standard historic preservation projects. They're basically reuse buildings of a lot of industrial buildings with excellent data on performance after the building was renovated to show how they became much more energy efficient so that they can get to the energy use minimums that we need to meet our 2050 mandates. So there's like 24 case studies in this publication. They're excellent. ASHRAE, which is the Association for the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Electrical Engineering. Let's see, don't even have the full acronym at this point. It's the heating and refrigeration guys. Anyway, they have just come out with their 2019 standards for preserving historic buildings and saving energy, which gets to the technical questions of how to. And this was vetted by a whole good group of both historic preservation experts and energy systems people. So we're moving, again, the collective documents to help us figure out best practices. And if you're, some of you may be familiar with this, but net zero is the penultimate in green design. This is now about 10 years old, a net zero historic rehab, solar PV panels for electricity, geo-exchange, in your backyard, drilling the holes down there. Basically, after that, two modern technologies, the rest of this is storm windows and insulation. Simple, straightforward stuff. And if you have the green power option of buying your electricity from a renewable source, you could probably even not do the PV panels, because I think something like 70% of America's historic houses have trees around them and no good solar access. So that, so if we commit all the buildings of America to solar access, we got a tree problem. So I don't think we should cut down all the trees. So we need green power from offsite. Now, in addition, in Boulder, to the issues of energy, which was a big focus for their climate change initiative, they also got into the issue of waste. Waste at the community, small scale level, but they took it to the big scale. Boulder will divert 90% of its waste stream from landfill by 2030. And if you get a demolition permit to get one in Boulder, you need to prove that you can divert 65% of the building that you're demolishing is material by weight from landfill. So basically it means you can't just throw it away. You've got to divert it. Now, sometimes diversion could be a non-landfill, but also used as fill. So if you have clean concrete or brick, you can put it in as fill and it doesn't go in sanitary. So there's some ways to trick this. But the whole point is that they see a very strict deconstruction requirement becomes a part of the preservation requirement. It's better to save a building and reuse it if you don't know how to divert it. So this becomes a sort of a back-sided handed sort of preservation rule, forcing people to think, where does the waste go when you throw a building away? And we haven't been doing that in the Midwest. I drove up here today from Springfield. You come by Pontiac and you look over and you see those giant mounds over there. That's tipping fees from the Chicago metropolitan area going down to the county there, putting with their big landfills. So this is another side to preservation, is avoiding waste. Now, The benefit of building reuse from a historic preservation and environmental standpoint. In 1980 for Preservation Month, or no, it was only Preservation Week in 1980. It's not Preservation Month. It's Preservation Month, right? So that's why we're here. It was only Preservation Week, but this on the left was the Preservation Week poster from the National Trust. Reusing buildings saves energy. Well, that was 1980, philosophy, kind of a nice graphic. In 2011, the National Trust, through the Preservation Green Lab, produced a building evaluation study called The Greenest Building, quantifying the environmental value of building reuse. And they basically posed the question, if you tear down a building and you're going to build something new, how can that be green? What's going on? So they dug into this and basically looked at different building types by different regions of the country and said, if you build a new building that meets modern energy standards versus maintaining the old building and using it, how long does it take before you have net energy savings? And basically it takes decades to make up for it. Because basically there's a lot of energy that it takes to make new buildings. And I contend that these numbers are really less than they should be. Because what they didn't do is give you demerits for the waste of the old building energy that you threw away. So there was no penalty for throwing an old building away. They only measured, is the old building energy efficient at X level and the new one this one, what's the difference between that and the energy that took to make the thing. So this data presents a positive preservation story for building reuse, and I don't think it's even as strong as it could be. We could make the argument even stronger if you gave demerits for waste, which the quote study didn't do. But this hasn't stopped people. There's a whole trend out there of tearing down buildings and building new things to be green. And this is in Chicago. It was the first LEED Platinum house in the US, designed by a very reputable preservation and design architect with green credentials. And viable, retrofittable housing is thrown away and replaced. And for $1.2 million, you can now have a house on 2 city lots for one person that's green. So what does this mean, guys? It means there's a big disconnect here. We don't really look collectively at reuse. We basically have some bias in the green rating system that's about points for doing things that are new, but no negative for throwing away and wasting old. And that disconnect still exists within the USGBC. Now, the USGBC has been doing some sophisticated stuff. I'm not totally negative. I think there's some credits issues, but I think there's something really interesting. I just did a survey of community and environmental performance preferences. Livingstandard.org, they published this. This is just within the last month. And they surveyed the public with a really professionally done survey on environmental values and basically posed, what should you do for the betterment of the environment? And the way they posed it is something like better health and safety or life for the future. And most people think, well, recycling is all we've got to do. That's the number one thing. So we're really still talking about the little stuff. And when it comes down to here on the bottom left there, green buildings, 11% of the public thought that was something important, and 17% thought it wasn't important. So there's a huge disconnect between the broad public and environmental values and buildings. And I think the same thing can be said from a preservation standpoint. We talk about building reuse being green. Even when the people that are pushing green survey the public thinks green is small scale actions. Plastic bags or paper or plastic or recycling. But the big picture issues of the built environment, buildings and how we use them, where we live, how we move, have not mobilized a lot of public input. That's what this data is showing. And now the USGBC, to be fair, they're going, how do we reposition our messaging to get around this idea? That people think it's just the little stuff that counts. But people do want to do things that they can make a difference with. But I think we collectively should get together with them and talk about green buildings and reusing buildings as one of the most effective strategies we can do for the issue of climate change. So we both, green people and we, have got to do our work to get that message out there. The public, Go Green stamps came out in 2012, and I think there's one thing in there that's about buildings. Insulate your home. But I do like the clothesline, what I call the solar clothesline, right? Now, is it legal to have a clothesline in Oak Park? Is that right?
Yes.
It is. Well, that's good. Because in a lot of places, it's not. It's not. You know, we've got this embedded culture against hanging out things to dry, you know? And, you know, so even having to recreate tradition and doing things the way we used to do. Old is the new green, you know, having a clothesline can be real. But I point this out, that on a day-to-day basis, I think the public is getting saturated with the paper plastic discussion and small scale things, but we're not preaching and getting any traction on the big message of reusing the built environment. So if we're having trouble on the preservation side, the green people are having that trouble on the larger side too. Which brings me to this, waste not. Losing a building for a single-story surface parking lot is both bad preservation and bad environmentalism, and bad urbanism. We don't need one-story buildings with three-quarters of the block as parking around it. That's not a replicatable urban design law. You have the opportunity here to challenge that. This building is eminently rehabable in terms of the scale, the open bolster truss, the format of these. These are easy buildings to reuse compared to a lot of other kinds of things. So that's one of your challenges here, is to figure out how to best repurpose this building from both a preservation and environmental standpoint. And that's kind of my message tonight. But I want to leave you with something really positive. I like to quote some of these people that are out there, and one of my favorites is Bucky Fuller. And this is the Fuller Challenge: to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or disadvantage to anyone. So there it is. Equity, economy, and ecology all together put in a poetic statement about what sustainability design is. So that's my message, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
All right. So the panelists, if you want to slide up to the front, Frank, can you help me with setting up the roving slideshow? Before I introduce the panelists as they're moving up, I also wanted to mention, I forgot to say at the beginning, to thank great local shops. They're the ones doing the videography this evening, and it's my understanding that we're going to be able to post this seminar on YouTube. So, you know, behave yourselves, you know, it's going to be on the internet. So thanks to them for doing that. They donated their time and effort here to do that for us this evening. All right, so paper is all in order here. We have a really distinguished panel to talk about many of the issues that Mike raised during his talk, which I think was spot on as to sort of how this whole thing came about. It was spurred by the Hill Motor Company effort to preserve that here in town, which is still ongoing. But we saw that there was really a broader issue here at stake that involves people and communities throughout the Chicago region. How many people, just a show of hands, are not from the Oak Park here? And from wonderful. All right, good. So yeah, we really wanted to appeal to an audience that just went beyond, you know, the same old folks here in Oak Park that were preaching to the choir. We have a good, strong preservation ethic here in town that is being a little bit challenged right now, but we've had our challenges in the past, and we push on. So while we have our panel, there's going to be a rotating set of slides here that just show some different examples. Some of these were provided by our panelists on issues that they're going to talk a little bit about. And then I threw in a few. In fact, Mike, one of your slides with the building with the little things on top from Talon, that's one of the slides I threw in here as well. So these are kind of in a random order, so just to give you something to look at while we're talking. All right, so I'm going to introduce, we'll start with Lisa, you're on the end. This is Lisa DiChiara. She is the Director of Advocacy at Landmarks, Illinois. And you know what, I'm going to break down, I'm going to pull these out. No. Yeah. All right, as Director of Advocacy, Lisa is on the front line of all calls for assistance on preservation issues from Landmarks Illinois members and the public, and manages Landmarks Illinois' major advocacy initiatives in the Chicagoland area. From 1998 to 2002, she worked for the Detroit office of Heinz Interest, coordinating the urban planning components and public approval processes for General Motors' renovation of the Renaissance Center in Detroit, in their new corporate headquarters. She's worked previously for the Midwest office of the National Trust of Historic Preservation and the Architecture Department of the Chicago History Museum. She currently serves on boards for the AIA Chicago Foundation, the Glessner House Museum, and on the Land Use and Housing Committee of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Lisa received her BA in Art and Architectural History from UCLA and an MS in Historic Preservation from Penn. Great. Gunny is next in line there. Gunny Harbo is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. He's an architect with over 30 years of experience and currently runs his own small firm, Harbo Architects. He gained a national reputation for his award-winning restorations of the Rookery and Reliance buildings and has restored many iconic modern masterpieces by Mies van der Rohe and Frank Lloyd Wright. Gunny got his Master of Architecture from MIT, is Master of Science in Historic Preservation from Columbia, and has a history degree from Brown. Gunny is a founding member and current president of ICOMOS ISC on the 20th Century Heritage. He's a founding member of Docomomo US, as well as remains on the board, and he's an adjunct professor at IIT. He's lectured all over the world on preservation topics. Next is Laurita Blank-McIntosh. Laurita is a senior project architect at Rath & Johnson, national engineering, architecture, and forensics consulting practice. She has over 12 years of architectural experience, specializing in building enclosures consulting in the areas of masonry conservation, facade restoration, roofing, and the waterproofing investigation and repair design. She consults on related enclosure performance issues involving historic preservation, adaptive reuse, and historic preservation. Her portfolio of experience includes numerous National Register and National Historic Landmark properties across the country. And finally, here on the end is Steve Kelly. Papers in order here. Steve has been a resident of Oak Park since 1983 and devotes his architecture and engineering skills to the preservation of our built cultural heritage. He's a UNESCO Tangible Heritage expert and is Secretary General of the International Scientific Committee on the Analysis and Restoration of Structures of Architectural Heritage. What kind of acronym is that, Steve?
SCARSA. It's SCARSA.
SCARSA. He gives a significant portion of his time to teaching the next generation of historic preservation professionals through lecturing for the Getty, Smithsonian, and university venues. So welcome to our panelists. So what we'd like to do is have each panelist talk for just a few minutes on topics related to what we've been discussing here. And then we'll have a conversation. I've got a few questions for you that have come up, definitely that Mike touched on as well. So we'll have a bit of a conversation and then we'll open it up to you all for questions. So you want to go back in reverse order and
Sure.
start with you, Steve?
Sure. Sure. Is this on? I'm Steve Kelly. That was a really great talk that Mike gave. Thank you, Mike, for setting this whole thing up. I have 5 points. I was told I have 5 minutes, so that gives me a minute per point, and I'm sure I'll go beyond that. So I want to start with the question, does a building have to be historic to have value as a resource? What does it mean? What does historic building mean? Technically, what that means is that governmental organizations decided that a building is historic. I like to talk about existing buildings, and I think that there are many buildings that aren't designated as historic that are worth saving as resources. For instance, the Foley Rice building is not a historic landmark, therefore, technically, it's not a historic building. I wouldn't agree with that, but that's technically the way that falls out. One of the things that Mike was talking about in his first part of his talk was the evolution of what we call historic preservation standards. He talked about SPAB, about the writings of John Ruskin, and he went to the Athens Charter, and then we go to the Venice Charter, the Secretary of the Interior standards. Every time they come up with these standards, they evolve. They should be evolved. They should evolve. They should be dynamic. We should be changing them all the time. These are not the 10 Commandments. Some people like to think of them as such, but they're not. They are guidelines that we like to follow, and I think that we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about historic buildings or existing buildings. A term that I see thrown around a lot is obsolescence, and I want to give you an example of that. For those of you who've lived in Oak Park for quite a long time, as I have, may remember that Richland Commons was going to be torn down about 10 years ago. There were a lot of articles in the newspaper about it. The developer had done a study. Their architect said that the building was obsolete. Why was it obsolete? One of the reasons was that the water in the boys' bathroom wasn't hot enough, or it took too long for the hot water to get there. That was one of the reasons why the building was obsolete. Another one was that the field to the west of Ridgeland Commons didn't drain and it flooded. Therefore, they were going to tear the building down. And if you think about that, to me that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There are easier solutions to those problems than to tear the building down. Their reality was they wanted to tear the building down because they wanted a new building. Fortunately, we had an economic downturn which stopped that project, and now we have a Ridgeland Commons, which is a redeveloped building within and outside of the envelope of the original building, and that's a very good model for us to pursue. That I think that the village of Oak Park, and I think that the villages in the west suburbs and all around Chicago, that's something that we should be looking at, is reusing those buildings. What is value? When we talk about value, when we read about the newspaper, developers come in and they talk about financial models, and really what they're talking about is how much profit they're going to be able to make. But there are other values that we should be looking at, which I think are just as important, and sometimes they're even more important. It's not just monetary value, but we have social value, cultural values, aesthetic values. We architects like to say architectural values, but let's call it aesthetics, because that's something that all of us can appreciate, or the aesthetics. Historic values. These are all of the values that we should be looking at when we're looking at properties in Oak Park. Finally, I want to close with there should be one image up there of single-use plastics that are floating in the water. And you know, we're looking a lot now at single-use plastics, and we're starting to understand that we shouldn't be using things just once and then throwing them away. I travel all over the world. I've been to a lot of third world countries, and I can tell you that single-use plastics are clogging up the rivers and streams in Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, in India. It's happening all over the world. So why is it that we have single-use buildings? We should be looking at using our buildings over again. I would like to challenge our village board of trustees when they're looking at the development of any site to start by looking at the building that's there already and start by saying, okay, is there a way that we can reuse this building? We should start there. It's very easy for a developer or a contractor to scrape a site clean. They know exactly how much that's going to cost. And then they know exactly how much it's going to be to build a new building. But reusing a building, there are some uncertainties there, and it offers a wonderful challenge, I believe, and it's a challenge that we should rise to meet. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Laurita Blank. I'm a millennial, the oldest of them, but nonetheless, so my notes are on my phone. So I am a new transplant to Oak Park. Hadn't been here more than a few weeks, and I got the invitation to participate in this panel. And surprise, surprise, I knew exactly what building they were talking about. I was on the phone and I said, oh, this is the building with the mechanic gargoyles. And it was a building that had jumped out to me. And I think that's a testament to kind of the quiet specialness of this building, is that even someone who's an out-of-towner, now admittedly someone in the industry, but someone who's an out-of-towner recognized that there was something about this building. It had a presence on the site, it had a value in where it was on the streetscape. And despite it having an empty and somewhat scary storefront presence. So I was introduced as a historic preservation architect, a historic preservation specialist. That's overly generous. I would say I'm a pretty terrible preservationist. I'm a little too liberal for that. But I have a deep love for old buildings, and for existing buildings too. But my passion is more on the side of materials and performance, which means that in my practice I'm very open to compromise. I don't, as a rule, tend to get hung up on the preciousness of authenticity. To me, it makes more sense to do what's practical, serviceable. And you want to keep that within some confines of acceptable aesthetics. But really, we're looking to service the building because, I do believe that we design and we preserve for the future generations, not for ourselves. And so in my thinking, something that's not quite right but performs well is almost always preferable, almost always superior to something that is authentic to a fault but doesn't have the service life, it doesn't have that level of performance. And I'll throw out a couple examples that I think everyone can relate to. If you have a building with a limestone, like a Joliet limestone, that over time does not perform well, and you go back with that same stone in the name of authenticity, knowing in that 50, 75, 100 years from now, somebody's going to have to come back and repeat the work that you just did. There's a value decision to be made there, but it's something that needs to be thought about carefully. And it's something that in my practice that pops up all the time is windows. I'm a firm believer that windows are a maintenance item. Let the fist fights in the back break out. I am not going to get hung up on them. I want them to look well, I want them to look right. But we as a profession are extraordinarily fussy to a fault about windows, sight lines, profiles, muttons, when what we should be focusing on is not only the performance of the system, but the quality control and quality of the assurance of their installation, so that whatever window goes in performs well. And I think that's a little bit different of a tack that I try to take in all my projects. I try to approach them scientifically, systematically, with a respect to the building, the respect to how it wants to perform, how it's performing in the ways that it's compatible and not compatible with what we want it to be doing. And there is a really interesting question there about this idea of rehabilitation of buildings and this adaptability of their reuse. And I've included some photos, you'll see them click through, of what I would call a very modern type of high-rise facade. We've got glass windows, stone panels, this very flat, horizontal aesthetic. And everybody, I'm sure, looks at those and they go, ooh. But those buildings from the 70s, those buildings from the 80s, much like millennials, we are eking into the realm of historic. And why does that matter? And how does that relate to the Foley Rice building? Well, I think they're part and parcel of the same problem, is that that building at one time was also terribly modern. It used a modern structural system, the bowstring truss, to have those wonderful open spaces. It used modern materials, brick and terracotta. It used those systems to an advantage. It had large glazing and large storefront for the retail facings. And it was never an architectural wonder as a building. It was more of a workaday building. But it's a quiet little gem, and it has a nice presence. That, like I said, even someone who didn't know the history of the building, had no idea about the history of Motor Row and the importance of that to Oak Park, it still jumped out. And it's a form and a shape that lends itself very well to the right redevelopment, just like a modern office building. But we need to be willing, and we need to be promoting the idea of meeting these buildings halfway. And we'll close with the thought that real historic preservation is a spectrum, and that's a good thing. That's not a compromise as a dirty word. The right approach for most buildings is somewhere in the middle of precious and tear it down. And to keep these buildings functioning in a sustainable way, and by sustainable I mean part of our active built environment, we need to be willing to be a little more flexible and at least promote the idea and the conversation about the flexibility of our profession, so that there's not a perception that we're fussy old timers who want nothing to change. Because I think that is very harmful to our practice, and I think it jumps in the way that it causes problems and gets in the way of the type of redevelopment projects that would be so perfect for this building.
Now it is? So we have my slides up behind us right now. I just sort of had 2 points. One is that started with the pictures of Notre Dame, and Mike talked about that very eloquently. By the way, I've known this man since 1981, when he was one of my very influential instructors at Columbia University, teaching me about Main Street and many other things, and I've always been grateful to you. And having your lecture tonight was really a good trip down memory lane for me. I appreciate it, and even though it was a totally different subject matter. I learned a lot, and I'm glad to hear it again in a different way. So for me, I have Notre Dame, which is very timely, as was said. It's the theoretical. It's about how do we think about cultural heritage in a global scale? What does it mean to people to see something that evokes so many feelings and thoughts and really important questions that you have about who you are, what it means to you. I mean, Americans, I think, had a very visceral, everyone I know, of course, it's the historic preservation folks mostly I talked to about it. But I mean, that afternoon was horrible. I felt sick all afternoon watching the feeds from Paris about what was going on. Are we going to lose that building? I mean, it was really, really scary. And thank God that it was not as bad as everyone had anticipated, but certainly bad enough. And then the questions came, what are you going to do? The Prime Minister comes out, we're going to rebuild in 5 years. Well, they're not even going to know what to do in 5 years. I mean, that building's 800 years old. And it's been studied ad nauseum. They know a ton about it. They have some of the best minds in preservation that you can imagine are going to be working on it. I have no question that they have all the right people to work on it. But the politicians can often get in the way of what should really be done in the greater good of what should happen for an item like that. And the philosophical debate, it started right away. Steve and I are both very active with ECOMOS, which is this international preservation organization, and there was a lot of bantering about, oh, are they going to find the trees, and what are we going to do, and this and that. Anyway, for us, at that nerdy level, it was very, very interesting, and I think that it's compelling on 2 levels. One at the professional, but also how it reaches the man on the street to engage them in that conversation that we're having tonight. And the second series of images that follow immediately after that are a bunch of urban houses. I live in Lincoln Park in Chicago. I've been there 30 years. I've lived in my neighborhood for 20 years, and I moved there because I could buy an old row house that I could afford. And it's actually now it's in the Sheffield district. That's now one of the things that the Landmarks Illinois is saying is endangered. Well, it's beyond endangered. It's almost all gone, at least on my block. And what you see, in fact, pictures that you'll see, my house sort of is off to the right, and it's slowly, on my block, the 2100 block of Dayton Street, which is just west of Halsted, I'd say there's probably 60–70% of that block has been destroyed and rebuilt in the last 15 years. And it's not for the better. I'm not here to say that you can't find or have reason to take a building down and build something better. That's certainly possible, and I love the story. You all know Tim Samuelson?
Yeah.
Okay, well, so the great famous Tim Samuelson story is about him going as an 11-year-old to meet Mies van der Rohe and try to talk him out of tearing down the old federal courthouse in the center of Chicago. And the punchline was, Mies says, "Well, I hope one day you will look upon my building and try to see some of the same things that you see are so wonderful about the federal center." And I think Tim would say that today he sees that, okay? He gets that. So they took down an incredibly beautiful building and they put up a really impressive, important building that is a National Historic Landmark today. So that, I think, is a fair trade. You have to think about what it is that's coming new. It's not that everything has to stay forever. I'm not in that ilk. But you certainly have to be careful about what are you giving up and what are you getting in return. And taking down a building like this beautiful old building we're talking about here in Oak Park that was with the nice detail and everything else, to put up what we are pretty sure will be not an architectural landmark in the future. If it's a typical grocery store thing, and understandably so, because they're going to want to do it economically and so on. I don't know that that's a good trade. So you need to balance those things. You need to think about those things. Every case has its own story. You got to understand the facts. This is the thing about Notre Dame. They really need to understand what are we dealing with before they make decisions about what to do, and that's always the case. So I'm rambling, but that's all I really had to say, and look forward to the discussion.
Hi everyone, I'm Lisa DiChiara with Landmarks Illinois. The good thing about going last is I get to quote all of my colleagues here at the table so far. I think Gunny is absolutely correct. I think all of us would look at the Mies van der Rohe Federal Center and agree that that was a fair trade, and that whatever it is that's going to presumably replace the Hill Motor building is not a fair trade, even though we haven't even seen design plans yet. But we can guess from what this company has built elsewhere that that probably will be the case, that it'll be some type of design that's anywhere, any other suburban community, and we will lose a distinctive building that I've never seen anywhere else. I think too that Laurita had a good quote where she said historic preservation is a spectrum and that we need to meet halfway because there are market realities. We all understand that, and Landmarks Illinois, even though our name sounds stuffy, we're not just about landmarking and making sure that buildings stay pristine. We are also about being flexible and finding reuse options that make sense for older buildings, whether they are officially landmarked or not. And the images that I brought that you've been seeing with the roll here of slides is the former Berwyn Bank, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with because Berwyn's so close by. And that was a campaign we were involved in for several years trying to save that building. Which ultimately, finally, was repurposed for a restaurant, which isn't the restaurant it is now today, but it's a restaurant that took the building and converted a bank to a new use that made sense, and then they did put on an addition. And as the images go by, some of you are going to think that addition is ugly and that it's tacky. But the reality is it helped make the project work, and it created a situation where it could still give the building the ability to function the way it needed to function with its new use. So I think the advocates here have clearly been saying that it's not about a pristine renovation for the Hill Motor building. It's about a conversion to a store that we know can be done because there's models of it elsewhere where an auto showroom has been converted to a store, and particularly even a grocery store. We've seen it in Galesburg, Illinois. If Galesburg can do it, I think Oak Park can do it. As Mike pointed out, in Motorola and in Chicago, many great reuses of those buildings. And then with the vacant lot next door, the ability to still do new construction adjacent to the older building as well. We obviously love incentives. We talk about the need for historic and preservation incentives all the time. Again, not always necessary. These renovations and rehabs do not need to be done in accordance to the Secretary of Interior standards and with the use of federal historic tax credits. No one is denying that that's not easy. It's not easy. When Mike used to review these projects for the state, I used to get complaints all the time about how hard he was in reviewing these projects. You know, one of the incentives we unfortunately lost in tax reform under the current, oops, did I lose this? Did I do that? No.
There's one.
Yeah.
One of the incentives we lost with the tax reform of this administration was something called the 10%. I'm not touching it. The 10% rehab tax credit. And that was a program that allowed people to reuse a building that was older than 50 years old without having to go through any kind of rigorous design review with the State Historic Preservation Office. And just basically, it was a matter between you and your bookkeeper, your accountant, and you would file your taxes at the end of the year and say, this is how much money I put into this older building, and I now am going to receive 10% credits against the project. And unfortunately, that went away. This would have been a perfect building for a 10% credit. So we do have to continue to think about ways to motivate building owners to do the right thing. But we have to, as Steve pointed out, challenge our public officials. And remember, we elect them. And we have to really make the message clear that buildings like this are not throwaway, and that there needs to be very, very strict instructions, especially when you have as much public subsidy going into a project like this one is, as we know, that we expect high standards. And to me, high standards should mean reusing an older building that is as distinctive as this one and that you could never replicate again today. And I want to commend Chris Payne, who is here, who's the chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, because the Historic Preservation Commission did its job. They did what they were supposed to do. And as Steve also pointed out, the Hill Motor Company building is now considered not historic, in quotes. Well, of course we know it's historic. We know it was determined eligible for listing in the National Register by the State Historic Preservation Office, and the Historic Preservation Commission of Oak Park said it is eligible for local landmarking, and they are the experts, not your village board. But your village board made the decision not to accept that recommendation. So the message has to be clear that that was not a recommendation that everyone believes was appropriate. And so hopefully the conversation will continue at the Plan Commission level, and the message will be clear that design and good urban design, whether protected through the landmarking process or not, still needs to be part of this conversation, and retaining the existing building is good design.
Well, I want to start things off a little bit. I'm glad we have you here, Laurita. We hadn't met till before this evening, and it's good to have a millennial in our group. You've got to have all the generations shown here. And I want to touch on something you brought up, really, and that is the issue of authenticity and the admitted obsession that historic preservationists often have with authenticity of materials and character and design. And the Secretary of the Interior standards that have been referenced a number of times, which are these guidelines for certified rehabilitation if you want to get a federal tax credit, or often your local design review board will base their design, guidelines on the Secretary of the Interior standards. They're all about this authenticity of materials and design, and if you have to replace something, it has to be the same material, and look at all of that. And I think we can probably all agree that such a thing is critical for important monuments, the sort of highest level of historic buildings, and is probably appropriate for, getting tax credit incentives from the government. But what I want to have a conversation from you all is, what do we do about these buildings like the Hill Building that now officially isn't going to be historic, but is still an old building that is worth saving? How do we bring preservation into the mix of the whole issue of recycling buildings? Because it's good for our environment, it's good for our urban culture and way of life, but isn't this sort of pure, let's worry about the muttons and and the materials. So maybe anyone who wants to sort of jump in.
Well, you should call me out, so I'll start.
Okay.
Well, I think I'll step back from the recycling component of your question and take you back to something you said right at the beginning. I think as a practice, we muddle this idea of appropriate and authentic. And there are certainly at every level within the preservation spectrum, whether the strictest to the standards to a loosey-goosey just kind of trying to make it pretty again, there are questions and conversations and decisions about authentic and appropriate. And I would argue that at no point in any of these discussions is one right or one wrong. It's about the overall process and thinking about performance, service life, and aesthetics, and how those all play together in the life cycle of that building and in the moment that we're making our intervention. So I say that this idea that appropriate and authentic are not tied together is a little, or are tied together is a little strange to me, because I think we confound them in our discussions about materials particularly.
I'll weigh in on this one as well. There was this really interesting article that was floating around on social media 3 and 4 years ago. There was a woman, Parisian woman by the name of Madame de Fleury, and she fled Paris as a teenager at the beginning of World War II, and settled in the south of France and lived her entire life there. When she died in 2012, almost at the age of 90, in her will they found out that she still owned this apartment that was in Paris near the Moulin Rouge, and nobody had been in this apartment for 7 years. They went inside, and it was kind of like going into Cinderella's castle, because this woman had lived with her grandmother, and her grandmother was a cabaret singer and dancer from the Belle Epoque, and it was decorated in that particular style. Very authentic. And that kind of authenticity doesn't exist anywhere. That is a fairy tale, because authenticity in reality is a construct that we use when we talk about buildings. We know what we mean when we say authenticity and authentic, and we know it's authentic, but really the pure authenticity is something that doesn't really exist in almost all buildings. If you've traveled in France, let's forget about Notre Dame. What about Reims Cathedral? I visited Reims Cathedral. I had no idea that in World War II it was bombed and burned down, and you could stand in the narthex and look up and you could see the sky. And it's been completely reconstructed. Nobody knows that anymore. They go and they go, wow, this is fantastic. This is an 800-year-old Gothic cathedral, but it's been reconstructed, as have many of the cathedrals throughout Europe because of fires, because of World War I, because of World War II. So as far as the Foley Rice Building goes, I was in the Foley Rice Building about 10 years ago. I was I was an instructor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and we took our students there. We went through it. As a matter of my career, all I do is evaluate existing buildings. And I've looked at maybe 1,000 different buildings. And I know when a building has good bones. The Foley Rice building has good bones. That doesn't mean we have to save everything there, but it's got good bones, and you can't replicate some of the materials that were used, some of the craftsmanship that was used, and some of the construction techniques. You could replicate them for sure, but you wouldn't replicate them. And so so for that particular building, it's really a good idea to look and see just exactly what we can use in that building, and not get hung up on this construct of authenticity.
Just to touch base in a more philosophical manner, I like to think of buildings as renewable resources, right? We're supposed to be moving to renewables. We're looking at renewable resources, and the industrial commercial buildings of the early 20th century and 19th are very much renewable. The bones are solid, they have great structural systems. You know, we're going to update them with all the new things that are needed from the mechanical plumbing side, and maybe they're going to have different windows than they had. And that building, a book I talked about, building reuse, 90% of the examples are there. So I think the culture's catching up to this around the country. That sort of solid bones buildings like that can be reused. And if there's not a higher density requirement coming in major centers of Paris and London, and it's not really coming in Paris, it's more like Chicago. And you're getting a density question here too, I know. But for the most part, those buildings are easily reusable. And one of the terms of art that we have to come up with and deal with is what I call the infeasibility study. Somebody looked at it and, you heard that from Steve. Somebody said, well, you can't use that. It's got mold, it's got lead paint, it's got something, and I'll put a finger on that aspect of it. Well, if you went to the doctor and the doctor said you got a fatal condition, you generally say, can you refer me to an expert in my condition for a second opinion? And that's what an historic preservation architect is, when you get a fatal opinion. We can be that expert second opinion that goes, yeah, there is a way to fix that. It doesn't have to be fatal. That can be dealt with. So we have to develop that collective expertise to know that we can be part of the equation.
Just a quick follow-up. Most of my 30-year career has been on the high-end scale of restoring icons, basically, which is incredibly fun and great, and authenticity is a huge issue. I think you need to look at every resource and understand what it is about those resources that we're talking about, that we're trying to say. What are those intrinsic values, as Steve talked about, that value proposition? What are the values, the aesthetic values, the historic values, the social values? What is it about that building that we even think is worthy of saving? Everybody in this room probably agrees there's things about that Foley building that are important. What are they? And then how do you intervene with that building in a way that saves those values, the pieces of value proposition that are going to allow that building to continue to speak to you and future generations about what it is that it presents that are important, and what are the things that you can improve, change, make better, find a way to have it perform better, find a way to allow it to be a grocery store, which it wasn't before. All that ought to be something that you can manage within the overarching idea, which is to say what it is about it that's important, even if it isn't a quote landmark. Or if it is a landmark, you have the same kind of questions you have to ask, and that involves understanding the building really well, physically and historically, and what is it about it, and then what are you able to do? So you got to get people that understand those issues and that are talented enough. A lot of the images you see here with these highfalutin architects, I love the ones where the hats go on the top of it. Those are crazy. And unnecessary in many cases. Sometimes it's okay, but in most cases they're unnecessary. It's just trying to make a statement. But what could be done in this case to allow all that to occur and still have all that sustainability positive aspect? I mean, it's a win-win-win-win situation. That's what you should be striving for. In the city of Oak Park, I mean, I think this is just one case where you're struggling with this question. And as the development's coming and you're getting the high rises and the density questions coming, it's something you really need to grapple with and find out how do you figure out a way to allow these other buildings to survive and be reused and add to the long-term conversation about what is Oak Park, which is a fabulous, beautiful city.
And so beautiful that it shouldn't be any suburb USA. Because, again, we know this is not a throwaway building. I don't think I can add much more than what my colleagues said here, so I'm going to let you go on to the next question.
So, Mike, you brought up in your lecture, and we've sort of touched on a little bit, there's some images thrown up, there's some that I threw in, the idea of facadectomy. And for those who don't know what a facadectomy is, it's basically taking the pretty front of a building, saving that, and ripping down the rest of it and back and putting up a new building behind it. This was a derogatory term, at least when I came of age, and was not an appropriate preservation response when we're talking about historic preservation with a capital H and P. So what I want to throw out to you all is, how do you feel about facadectomies? Are they appropriate, or under what circumstances are they appropriate? And what makes a good facadectomy versus, a badly mangled one that you just go, oh, what were they thinking?
Should I go first?
Sure.
So, at Landmarks, Illinois, we get these types of questions all the time. What is an appropriate compromise when a community is trying to save a building and we're trying to figure out, with public officials who are not willing to basically stick their necks out against property rights and trying to convince an owner that the building is worthy, and to Mike's point, the infeasibility study has gotten around and we've been told the building's not viable and can't serve this use, blah, blah. We hear it all the time. So the question is facadectomy is sometimes deemed appropriate because at least it's better than nothing. You know what? It's a case-by-case situation. For those of you who may or may not be familiar with the McGraw-Hill building on North Michigan Avenue in Chicago, that was a building that Landmarks, Illinois was very involved with campaign. That was in the 90s when we still picketed and had actual petitions on clipboards. It was and megaphones, pre-social media. That was a building that we managed to get a compromise on the developer, John Buck, with the help of the city, because John Buck had already demolished the entire 600 block of North Michigan Avenue. And so if you go by that building today on Michigan Avenue, you would have no idea that it was a facadectomy. I mean, the city made sure that that building was built back up in a way that you would have no idea from the exterior, that once you go inside it, it's a gutted shopping mall. And so, to me, I'm glad that that project happened, even though it is technically a facadectomy, because it retained the streetscape. It was always more about the exterior and retaining the streetscape of North Michigan Avenue than the interior. Someone earlier referenced, I think it was Mike, Wabash. There's a lot of facadectomies on Wabash in downtown Chicago, around where my office is, Washington and Wabash. A lot of people walk that stretch and you would have no idea that those are facadectomies. You have the L line right there. It's hard to look up in some areas, and even if you're on the L platform and you look into those buildings, you wouldn't necessarily know those were facadectomies. So there is a place for it in urban planning and urban design. We just don't necessarily want to make a practice of it, but there are obviously opportunities where it can work. And I think the image that Mike showed of the Whole Foods is not our preferred outcome of a facadectomy. But I don't know, are we better that that facade is still standing there? Because it is quite a beautiful facade, it's just too bad it has the clunky boxes behind it. So, I would never promote that for the Hill Motors building, that a facadectomy is the solution. But everything should be discussed in terms of alternatives. Nothing should be taken off the table.
I agree with everything you said, other than the fact that facadectomy is the polite term. I prefer facadomy. Facadomy is what it is. And it's not historic preservation. And she carefully crafted her answer to say it. She didn't say it as polite or as impolitely as I have. I see why, as an urban decision, you might do that. As an aesthetic decision, you might do that. It certainly does well from the street. But I would challenge to say, if the building is not worth saving, then make something better. This is what I said before about the Mies story. I mean, you know, there are very talented architects out there in the world today, and they're very capable of doing good buildings. If your desire is to make the cheapest commodity you can, then you should find a way to use the building that you've got, because it's going to be able to do that for you already. And if the building isn't worth saving as a building, then I'm not sure it's worth saving. So that's my one answer I thought about that.
Believe it or not, one of my early projects I approved in the 80s was a facadectomy, for lack of a better word. You might have heard of the Chicago Theater. Next to it was the Page Brothers building, and the Lake Street facade of the Page Brothers building was Chicago's only intact cast iron facade. The full facade was cast iron. And that's what was significant, was the facade. And when they renovated the Chicago Theater and integrated it with the Page Brothers building, because the theater being a public assembly building, the structural system had to be non-combustible, so they wanted to take out all the wood frame flooring in the Page Brothers building, which meant just the facade would be left. And we said, you know, the facade was what was the designated component that was most critical of that building, and to make the integrated thing where we could approve that as part of the project. And that really helped make the deal work for the Chicago Theater project back in the 80s. Now, these are case by case, but there was a case of a specific designation of a facade building type of structural system was what made it significant, not just that it had a wood frame in it and the wood frame wasn't wrong. So case by case, there are times that it can come up, but on general, where you're seeing this mostly is where density is coming into play. You got a small scale building in a much higher, denser environment. That's where the pressure for the facadectomy comes. So the developer can extract more land out of the value, or more building out of the land value. And I don't see that being the case with the Hill building. It's a 2-story building, and you're proposing a 1-story building, I think. So this doesn't make any sense to me from an environmental standpoint. Anyone else want to touch that question?
Sure, I'll use facadectomy. It's a kinder word. I think it all has to do with scale. The image that Mike showed in his presentation was the Embassy of Mexico. It's on Pennsylvania Avenue in northwest Washington, D.C., a building I've walked by many times. And it looks so strange because it almost looks like there's a new building that has had an old facade put on it like a piece of wallpaper, and the building behind it is much bigger. I think that if you're going to save a facade in a way that there's not a skyscraper poking out of the back of it, that would be the preferred method of doing so. I'm not entirely opposed to doing facadectomies, and actually, if we ended up with a facadectomy at the Foley Rice building, I wouldn't be wholly dissatisfied with that, because I think that what the facade of that building adds to the streetscape of Madison is one of the things that that's one of the character defining features. I think that's the main character defining feature. But I remember that in 1992, it just shows how crazy I am. I took my family, my young kids, into the former East Germany. It was right after the wall came down. We drove into Leipzig, and Leipzig is this really wonderful medieval town. We were able to see it. I went back again in 1997 for a conference, and they were trying to bring all their buildings up to West German design standards, and they were hollowing out all of these buildings in the downtown area. They were leaving all the facades in place, and they were putting in all new interiors. And I haven't been back since, but I have a feeling that if any of us went to Leipzig today, we'd walk around in a wonderful medieval city, and if we happen to gain interest in one of the buildings, we would find that they have great plumbing and electrical systems and heating and air conditioning. So.
The city of Porto in Portugal is the same way. When I was there 10 years ago, I got tours. They were taking the facades, saving those with a beautiful Portuguese tile, and completely demolishing the buildings behind them and rebuilding them as modern buildings so they could have modern apartments and commercial storefronts. So it happens probably a lot more than we even realize, whether it be through wars or through modern upgrades. One more question for you all, and then we'll open it up to the public here. And this may be, especially Lisa and Mike, be particularly interested in hearing. Lisa, you mentioned the demise of the 10% tax credit with the tax rewrite here. Is there a way, one of the biggest challenges I think we really have is encouraging and incentivizing people to reuse historic buildings. Mike, you talked about Boulder, almost de-incentivizing demolition by the strict requirements for recycling or avoiding the landfills. So what are the kinds of ways that we can incentivize or de-incentivize demolition, or incentivize the reuse of buildings that are different than the sort of high-end preservation, you got to meet the standards, you get the federal tax credit type of incentives? I'm talking about these buildings that are in the middle that aren't going to get tax credits, for whatever reasons. But still, we need to encourage people, the developers who are bottom line focused, how can they incorporate existing buildings into that?
I want to say a large portion of what we do at Landmarks Illinois is lobby, and we lobby for financial incentives. And we're lobbying for financial incentives at the federal level, at the state level, and then we're often trying to help local municipalities understand that they should also be thinking about incentives at the local level. And to be creative, because at the local level, you have a little more of the ability to be creative. So, what Boulder is doing is really remarkable. And I wish a community like Oak Park would look at Boulder, because I know Oak Park is a community that prides itself on sustainability. And, I think that we have to, again, go back to our public officials and try to challenge them that reusing older buildings is not just about trying to maintain things that are historic. And I hate the term historic preservation, even though it's my lifelong field. I've never liked it because it gives you a misinterpretation of what it's about. We're talking about not restoration, we're talking about practical reuses of older building stock. And so incentives at the local level can be very broad and can be creative. And so I think here too, we really have to continue to discuss, as we have been, that we're not talking about pristine renovations, we're talking about practical reuses. And there are incentives already on the books that are not being promoted enough by a community like Oak Park. Class L is a commercial reuse incentive at the county level that commercial buildings in Oak Park are eligible to take advantage of if they are locally landmarked, but there's a little more flexibility in that design review than there would be with federal historic tax credit projects reviewed by the state and the Park Service. The city of Chicago has building permit fee waivers. So if you are an owner of a landmark property, if you're doing any kind of rehab, you can automatically get your building permits fees waived. So there's other ideas out there, and I just think public officials and communities have to work together to find what those incentives can be. And I want to also let Oak Parkers know you're not alone in this struggle. We've been dealing with suburban communities all around right now that are just being easily swayed by developers that they're they're going to tear down the older building stock to build these big new developments. And a lot of times it's in the name of TOD. And while we as people who understand good planning, and again, density does belong in the downtown near public transit, it doesn't mean older buildings have to be thrown away. They can be incorporated into larger developments. And between Glen Ellen and LaGrange and a lot of these places right now, older buildings are coming down in the name of these big mega developments. And so I just encourage you all to really try to continue to urge your public officials that you can have both. It doesn't have to be an either or choice. And that again, good urban planning is about, from a sustainability standpoint, from a good urban design standpoint, retaining buildings and trying to find solutions for them that can be incorporated into these larger projects. And that's what should happen with the homeowner.
Just to touch on another part of the public realm, a couple of weeks ago I participated in a national think tank on building codes and historic preservation. Because basically, this is the tool of the public sector to regulate what gets built, and our building codes have only recently been changed with the International Existing Building Code to basically become better and easier to use for historic preservation. So sometimes the incentive isn't necessarily the economic side, but on the regulatory side, not only developing new building codes that are more easily applied to existing buildings, but also making sure your local code officials get training on how to use those. And that was what we found out, is that the International Existing Building Code is much easier to use and makes it more feasible to renovate buildings, but there's a huge lag in the building code industry side that code officials are not getting training about that. So incentives don't always have to be on the side of economics, it could be on other regulatory components, and the building code would be one of those.
Laurita, did you have?
I was just going to say, as someone who practices on that side of it, Mike, you're spot on with that. The existing building code, the IEBC, is a bit of the redheaded stepchild of the building code world. Those of us who work with existing buildings are at worst aware of its existence, at best we're familiar with its requirements. The flexibility that it gives to designers to take reduced loads, particularly when you're looking at a change in use that requires significant structural modification, is extraordinary incentivizing in the construction cost side. But with some of these developments, you're often working with architects or designers who are more accustomed to ground up design. They're not as familiar with the efficiency that they can use with these other code options. And so I think you're spot on with the education of the profession and education of code officials. We've struggled, and in my past projects, I've struggled with code officials who don't understand the IEBC, and it makes them very nervous to trust someone's interpretation when it's not something they're familiar with. So I think that was a very good comment and a very nice foil to the economic incentive discussion.
What can be said to people who say that TOD developments are always much better than existing buildings that are smaller in terms of the environment? Because they encourage greater use of public transportation, and so they can tear down this existing building regardless of the waste involved, for example.
I mean, the fundamental concept of the question was, is higher density, transit-oriented development always better for the environment because you're concentrating people and therefore reducing the transportation costs? And the general answer is that you're right, density is generally better from an environmental standpoint, but it's still a trade-off relative to the scale of the community and all the other factors. Because there's really going to be a very tight area that is the densest part of that transit-oriented development. It's not going to be the entire shed of your town in terms of how far you go out. So I would generally say there's some kernel of truth that the density is better from an environmental standpoint. But again, our equation doesn't evaluate the waste when you throw away a building. So the green building codes ignore that fact, and they only look at that. And the green building codes don't actually have a factor for transit-oriented density when it comes to car use. Like you can tear down an historic school, like Libertyville did, and build a brand new school out in the countryside and triple the automobile travel to get to the school. But it's a green school because it was designed to be green and meet the criteria, which ignores the fact that it now is no longer transit-oriented. You know, so there's a lot of disconnect in the planning side. But I have to give them some value that higher density is generally better than lower density on an overall, but there's a lot of specific problems with that.
And I would add to that, that for me, the question of sustainability, it goes beyond just what's green, what's energy efficient, what has to do with, you know, the global change or climate change and all that. To talk about a sustainable society, we're also talking about those things that are important to us. We go back to that value proposition. So what is it as a society? What do we value as a culture? What do we see as being important to keep us going, to sustain us? Is more than just about the energy questions. It's about what makes you feel good every day when you walk by the building. Is that something that you have a positive feeling about it? Those are things that people haven't actually done studies of or calculated, but they're real. I mean, people do have a real emotional reaction to those kinds of things that I don't think anyone takes into account.
Sure, if I can get this to work, or you can just talk about it.
Hi, this is probably for Lisa. Can you tell us what's transpiring with Chicago Union Station?
So I was thinking about Chicago Union Station and when Mike was showing all his images of big additions coming out of buildings. Unfortunately, what was proposed for Union Station was not the Norman Foster type of image we saw at the Hearst Building in New York. But anyway, it basically went away. There was enough outcry with the proposed new construction addition design atop Union Station that it basically, the developers were told by the administration, go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there was a proposal to put a skyscraper growing out the middle of Union Station.
Right, and so now they're appropriately putting the skyscraper on the adjacent empty lot, and instead we'll be doing about a 2 to 3 story addition with appropriate setbacks.
Because that wasn't the building originally designed to have?
Yeah, the building was originally designed to have some type of addition, but of course now the building has been in existence for so long in its current form that it was still hard for people aesthetically to accept what that proposal showed. But it's still going to have an addition, it's just going to be much lower in scale.
And the most famous court case, the one that we always base it on, the Grand Central Terminal case, Grand Central was designed to have a tower on top of it, but they agreed that wasn't, they didn't have the right to do that again. That the historic preservation, the values that were associated to the building as it was built was what was important. So just because it was designed that way, it wasn't built that way. I mean, we can't start, there's so many examples of buildings that were designed a certain way, and you know what? They got built a different way. For lots of reasons. You don't necessarily go back to what was intended, you go back to what was done, because that's the story. Got to get the story straight.
Well, I'm going to challenge you on that one because Chicago Union Station actually had column stubs on the top of it because they were planning to go up higher. They just didn't have the money. There were some really interesting technical issues around the Chicago Union Station. It was designed before the First World War. They put in the foundation systems. At the end of the First World War, there was an economic downturn. Then they redesigned the entire station, and so they had to connect the caissons that they'd already put in place with grade beams, so the new columns didn't sit down on the old grade beams. It was very complicated, and it was supposed to go up about 20 stories. And they don't have the drawings anymore. And they did have them 25 years ago when I was working with Amtrak, and I found them in their storage, and I said, these are important drawings, you need to hold on to them. And 2 weeks later, they ended up in a dumpster. And I took them to the Historical Museum. And they may be there, or they may not be. But I think that there is a good argument that you could go up higher with that building if somebody could figure out technically how to do it and maybe how to be more in line with what was originally planned, which was a setback. It's a building of setbacks. And this latest one I saw, it was not a setback, it was kind of an overhang. Completely different.
But could and should are two different things, and they didn't. So the question, and he's a structural engineer, at least half of them is, which is why he sees that potential that he thinks should be fulfilled. And I would argue that the potential wasn't fulfilled, and for a lot of reasons. There are a lot of good reasons why it wasn't done, and that's why we see Union Station today. It's not the Union Station that might have been someday that was landmarked. It was the Union Station that is there today that was landmarked, and there are very specific reasons why it was. And those are the things that you have to look at, and those are the values that are embedded in that thing that you need to embrace. If you could add to it, and again, I think that they are in a subtle way, that's probably okay. But putting that stupid tower on there, and there were several different designs that were really all horrible, in my opinion, that wasn't a good solution. Even though you could, doesn't mean you should.
You're literally watching the Viollet-le-Duc Ruskin battle happen at this table.
Actually, I mean, I'm a Ruskinian in some senses, but, you know, the Rookery building had a lot of reconstruction, so I can't say that.
I'll take the Duke, that's okay with me.
Do we know if, before this issue came up, if any entity in the village, any body, any commission, went to the village board and advised them that they wanted the developer of this property to keep at least the facade of this building in any new development before this whole issue came up?
I was gonna say either Frank or Chris Payne, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes. You know, I don't know, Frank, if you want to answer that, or if you want me. You know, when I was chair of the Preservation Commission, going back into the 2000s, you know, we had an initiative to landmark it, and the current owner at that time, who was the dealer who had closed the business, they'd objected, and we kind of knew that, you know, under an objection, the village board would have been very unlikely to landmark it. So we compromised. We said, look, we'll keep tabling it. You know, we need, you know, allow you to market the building, etc. But it's out there that it's an historic, worthy of historic designation. That went on for years. I got off the commission, and you know, certainly the commission continued to have that on their radar. I think that, you know, a developer came in, there was the whole plan to curve the street, and in that case it certainly was in the way of the new curved street, but that then went away, and you know, it fell through the cracks, and I think the village board in a way kind of dropped the ball, and the village staff, planning staff, this thing just dies on you once in a while. Dropped the ball in the sense that you know, they knew that it was landmark worthy, and that should have at least been in the discussion of the RFP for the developers. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, you know, I just picking up on that. I mean, this is a frustration, is that municipalities have the municipal power to mandate good outcomes and good design, and they get very wussy because they're scared that the developer will then go away. And developers easily make threats that if you put on these really, you know, what they perceive as restrictions and demands of me, you're just gonna drive my cost and I'm gonna go away. These developers who have been interested in Madison Street or anywhere else in the park see Oak Park as a desirable community to invest. And there's a reason why they're coming here in the first place. And so there's no reason why village officials should not be more hard-lined about what's the final product and what's the final design, whether it's new construction or whether it's rehab. But when there is an existing building that everyone has acknowledged has definitely architectural merit at both the National Register level and the village level, that especially again, with as much public subsidy is going into this project, we know there's a lot of TIF money going into this project, they should be basically told, you have to retain this building and incorporate it into the project. And that should just be the way it is, otherwise no TIF money. And so, I mean, this is the message that has to be clear. And I hope that village board members, maybe, I know you have a few new ones, can continue, whether they want to look at it from the sustainability standpoint, or whether they want to look at it from the good design standpoint, both have merit. There's no reason to throw this building away. It should be a demand of the public subsidy. And the city of Chicago, with their PD process, does that. They make it very clear, if we're giving you TIF funds, you have to retain a building that has been determined eligible for listing in the National Register. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but at least there is a negotiation period and it is in writing in ordinance.
Two questions. I see the cameras around. Is video of tonight's meeting going to be available?
Yes, the great story, they are videoing this and they are going to be posting this on on Facebook, millennial there, on YouTube.
The comments that were made earlier about the existing building code standards, municipalities like Oak Park, for financial and other reasons, are now outsourcing their building code activity, building permits, inspections, and all that. In our case, we've got a firm out in DeKalb. When a firm is on the receiving end of numerous municipal building permit and inspection activities, do you find that they're any more willing, able, capable of following the existing building code standards in addition to the new building codes? Just because, places like Oak Park are saying we're not in that business so much anymore.
I mean, it's all a function of the level of training, but clearly, if the local building code officials are just getting lots of strip mall submissions, that's their expertise that they're developing about. If they're going to have a contract with a community like Oak Park, where most of the building permits are going to be for repair and renovation, then the city should be vetting that vendor for their skill set and saying, do they have people skilled in using the international existing building code? So it can work both ways. That, in vetting and hiring, you're looking for that expertise. But I would say on the whole, there is a lag in the building code official side of getting that training. And the International Code Council has not been offering a lot of training on it. And that's one of the deficits that we in the larger preservation community see and know that we've got to help address to bring up the training level so that there are more code officials that are familiar.
Yeah. We're a little bit after 9 here, but we'll kind of wrap this up here soon.
There's another possibility in the next few years. We have at Oak Park River Forest High School a field house that is historic, not considered historic, but it was built somewhere between 1924 and 1929. In the next 3 to 5 years, there's a chance that for the next phase of the Imagine plan that it will be ripped down to be able to put in a larger pool and some other athletic facilities. I called over a year ago to Springfield and left a couple of messages for people. I'm still waiting for a call back, probably not going to get it. In regards to how that works as far as whether it is considered or what is the criteria to get it considered rather than ripping it down. Go ahead.
It sounds like your question is getting a determination of eligibility regarding it. And I would say, I hate to say it, but I would start by going back to the local preservation commission to see what they have in the survey report and data information to then move the case forward for the National Register stamp. But start with
So you're saying go
local.
through Frank and Depot and the local historic?
Yeah, I think your local commission will have more information to give you the baseline to start.
Frank's the Historical Society. You wanted to
I will say that we've already had this challenge with the local preservation commission, and it didn't have to do with this particular building, but it had to do when they took down the chimney at the old high school. That they came in front of us just for an advisory review, and after, I think it was the third meeting, the lawyers for the school showed up and made a statement that it wasn't local building code that regulated what they do to the buildings, it's state code. So the local historic commission has no say in what happens.
So the local commission might be the source for getting the information, but then the issue is there a trigger of state permitting or review of the action? And that is kind of an open problem right now. I can't speak to the details of how the state is functioning right now. I haven't been there for a while, but
When the middle schools were the issue of being created and taking down the two others that came before our commission, I was chairing the commission at that time, and again, that was the same response, that the village had no authority to speak to the demolition or anything relating to this other taxing body.
This is how they get around it.
And
All right.
when Doug was there, we actually tried to landmark the stadium. And the landmark nomination was written up by Doug Park. And the school was unwilling to do it. So I think it would be important to get the high school to have some buy-in.
They will buy in.
Are there any final questions? We're after that. Yes, ma'am, over there.
I'm Vicki Haas from Maywood, and I really want to thank you for so many of the innovative thinking ideas that I've heard. And one of the things I want to say is just to offer, again, I do it, sprinkle it around, but Maywood is always willing to collaborate on projects like this. And I want to suggest maybe this whole idea, because our building code officers certainly are not up to a lot of considerations that could be improved. If there's somebody who wants to look at collaborating on how to educate building code and municipal staff and elected officials more on the training, I'd love for us to be part of that.
Well, I think we're 10, 15 minutes past 9, so I want to thank Mike and all our panelists. We largely avoided fisticuffs, so we were getting pretty close there near the end. Thank you all for coming. There are brochures and some literature on the tables in the back from some of our different sponsoring organizations, so please feel free to peruse that. If you do want to get an email with the link to the YouTube show, please sign up there. Please sign up for Save the Hill Coalition Facebook page. If you want to help preserve that building. The effort is ongoing. So.